ecology, and we're going to be talking mostly about vegetation tonight. And that's really the carpet of plant cover that's on the landscape in any given area. And you go out to a field that's been abandoned, for example, or a meadow, or a thicket that's growing up, or an early forest. That's a unit of vegetation. It's a vegetation type. It's an old field type. It's a thicket type. You can name each one of these vegetation types. But vegetation is essentially the carpet of all the plants, whereas if you're going to do a flora of an area, you're just listing the species present. And that's an interesting concept. The difference between a flora, then, is merely a listing of all the plants in your lawn, in the field back of your house. Just going out and listing them all, you would get a flora. But if you take all those species together as a carpet of vegetation, that's the vegetation. And it's the vegetation of the earth that is extremely interesting in terms of forests as one major vegetation type, grasslands, another major vegetation type, deserts, where I hope to be next month in the Sonoran Desert looking at the giant cactus after being there 20 years, 30 years ago, and looking at changes in the population of the giant saguaro in that particular vegetation type. Tropical rainforest, another major vegetation type, and most of these are dictated by climate. Obviously, the climate is different in a grassland than it is a forest. Here we have about 20 inches of precipitation, and as you go west into Iowa, Illinois, which is really grassland country, right? It's corn now, but I mean, potentially grassland country. The precipitation drops so that you don't get as much precipitation. It's also drier overall, and you get a grassland. If you go down to Tucson, the precipitation has dropped now to 10 inches of rainfall down in Tucson, and that's why it's desert. Tropical rainforest, we can double, triple this precipitation, can't we? And also end up with a very warmer kind of environment where there are now no frost. No frost. So now you're in the tropics, right? So only in the tip of Florida in the United States do we have anything approaching the so-called tropics, right? And that's why that area attracts people so greatly, because it has a slightly tropical air to it. It's just the very southern tip of Florida that gives you this subtropical part. Otherwise, Central America, South America, parts of Africa, you get this. So this then is how an ecologist begins to look at the landscape. We are here in the eastern deciduous forest. There are many different forest types. The eastern deciduous forest can be divided up into numerous vegetation types, and our area right here is dominated by oaks. It's sometimes referred to as the sprout oak forest, because when you cut oak trees, you know what happens. You get a whole set of sprouts coming up, so that in a forest, often you tend to see more than one tree. That can be brought about either by cutting, coming up from the old stump, or by a rabbit browsing it down, and then it will come up multi-stem. That's one of the features. Or maybe a fire comes by. So now we're starting to see various factors that can influence this vegetation. Fire, cutting, animal, browse. It can change its structure or its composition. So here we're in the oak. If you go a little further north in New England, it's beech maple forest. Beech maple forest. And you have a little vegetation map. I'm going to show you some slides. And you see you're down in this zone right down here, which on this map is called central hardwoods. So here's still another name given for this zone. central hardwoods. And the reason it's called central hardwoods is because there are northern hardwoods, right? And these are the northern hardwoods. So go up to New Hampshire, go up to Vermont, and you know that that's where you pick up your maple syrup, right? Well, you can buy some down here, but we don't have that many people tapping maple trees because we don't have that many sugar maple trees. We have lots of red maple, but sugar maple is the best tree to get the maple syrup from, right? So here are the northern hardwoods, beech maple, and yet we have these trees here. They're present in the central hardwoods, but they're not dominant. And that's what ecologists are often concerned about when they look at a unit of vegetation. Who is dominant? The oaks are dominant. We have a whole set of oaks, don't we? Red, black, white, scarlet, tin, etc. We can just keep going. Many different kinds of oaks make up this dominant oak central hardwoods forest. But since it's hardwoods, it's not just oak, it's also hickory, it's also red maple. Notice it's a different maple now. And it's also black birch or sweet birch. That's the one that tastes nice, right? You can break a twig and get the nice wintergreen taste out of black birch. So what we have here then, these are the major players, the actors that are part of the central hardwoods forest. We can do the same thing for this region, but we're not up in that region, so we're not going to develop that any further, see? And if we keep going north in New England, you know what you get into next. You start to lose those hardwoods, and you get into the spruce fir forest, don't you? In fact, sometimes it's called the spruce fir moose forest, right? Because that's the distinctive animal that's part of that major forest type. Whereas here in the deciduous forest, white-tailed deer is the major big mammal that's part of the system, right? So in each one of these major biomes, you can frequently associate certain animal species with it. Here you would think of the pronghorn, right, antelope, or the buffalo as being the distinctive species of the grassland. Now what we're showing here is factor interaction, things that influence this vegetation that we're going to be talking about. And of course we already have indicated that climatic factors are extremely important because they essentially dictate these major areas that are frequently referred to as biomes. So you have the eastern deciduous forest biome, you have the grasslands biome, you have the desert biome, you have the tropical rainforest biome. These are major vegetation biomes of the world. And we are in then part of the eastern deciduous forest biome. The Pacific vegetation type in southern New England is the central hardwoods, or you can call it a sprout oak forest. And some people have just called it the oak forest because oaks are so important. So it has different names. The sheet you have indicates central hardwoods. So this sheet then gives you a kind of overview of the major vegetation types of New England. Now the factors that interact here include climate, and it would obviously include precipitation. It includes the means and the extremes. The amount of precipitation is critical. The temperature is also critical in that freezing temperatures, yes, we get them, but not in the same vigor as in the spruce fir forest. And that's going to eliminate certain of these trees from going northward, the temperature. So precipitation, temperature, you have the means that tend to control the vegetation, but you also have the extremes. And in our area, hurricanes, one of the major extremes. 1938, was the last major blow. And that can literally remove a forest, as it did in the Arboretum, the Bowles Wood area that's beyond the Buck Lodge, out to the ledges where you drop down to the ravine where you've had field trips. That area was occupied by a hemlock forest, almost 200 years old, devastated, just in one day. Trees up to 200 years old. What I'm going to be looking at in the desert out here is a freeze that happened in 1962. And I was there just after that freeze and saw all these big giant cactus just going to mush as all their soft tissue had been frozen to death and then turned to bacterial ooze. And what I'm going to study is the recovery of that saguaro forest after the freeze. See, this is what ecologists do. They look at the dynamics of these systems, whether they're in a desert biome or whether they're in an eastern deciduous forest biome. And we have documented in the Bowles Wood Natural Area by permanent transects the changes that have taken place in the recovery of the hemlock forest. But now you know that there is a new threat. The hemlock woolly adelgid has arrived in the last decade, and it is now taking the hemlock out of this Bowles Wood natural area after it was coming back very nicely after the '38 hurricane. And we even wrote a paper with a graduate student that said that the future forest of the Bowles Wood natural area was going to be eastern hemlock. And we were wrong, because we didn't know that this introduced insect was going to come in and devastate. So you constantly have catastrophic events. So now we have still another factor that we have to plug in here around diseases. A whole set of factors, and of course this is human influence here, isn't it? Cutting, clearing the landscape is another operation. Taking out the forest completely and ending up with fields and agriculture, right? And then abandoning the fields. And then the field tends to go back to what the regional vegetation was in the general area. We have to add, we have animal impacts, we have human impacts, we have climatic impacts, we have diseases, and now we can add just a couple more, and we'll stop. Soils, the kind of soil is going to impact the kind of vegetation you have. You'll notice on this little map, there's an area out here on Cape Cod. Notice, that's a different vegetation. What is it? There it is. Pitch pine. Yes, those of you who've been out to the Cape know that you've got some oaks, but you've got an awful lot of pitch pine and scrub oak, right? And that's reflecting in the sandy soils. We have pretty good loam soils here. So we had an oak forest. But here on Cape Cod, they've got a pitch pine scrub oak. Now that's another kind of oak. And as the name implies, it's kind of scrubby. And its leaves are kind of woolly on the undersurface, but it still has an oak-like leaf, typical pointed leaf. But the plants seldom get to be big trees. They're normally scrubby because they're constantly being subjected to fire, because this is a fire type. And there are vegetation types around the world that we think of as fire types. We also know that our oak forests have burned too, as we'll point out later. But basically, this is an extremely vulnerable fire type. And then finally, we've got geology that we have to plug in. because sometimes the kind of bedrock that's in a given area can also dictate the vegetation. Not so much in most of Connecticut, but up in northwestern Connecticut and into Massachusetts, there is a fair amount of limestone bedrock. And those of you who know limestone, you put it on your garden, don't you? To change the acidity. Calcium carbonate. Yes, this is loaded with calcium. And you get a whole set of plants known as calciphiles that tend to grow naturally on limestone. So you can go up to Bartholomew's Cobble just over the border in northwestern Connecticut and see all kinds of plants. In fact, the vegetation locally is different because of the limestone. So geology can also have an effect. And finally, we can plug in slope as another factor that can affect the vegetation. And slope is north versus south. And I've been putting my ashes out from my wood stove, and I usually make a little volcano. You know, I just keep pouring the ashes, and you know how you do that, and they just keep rolling down, and you get this nice cone-like structure. And then it snowed the other day, and then the sun came out. And all of a sudden, I saw the effects of microclimate. Because on the north side of my volcano, I had snow. But on the south side of my little volcano, it was ashes. Right? So the heat of the south sun, you see, had taken off the snow. It was warmer on the south slope compared to the north slope. And that's true here in Connecticut. North slopes are cooler. So any species that occurs a little further north, such as beech and maple, might be more important on the north slope, right? Whereas on the south slope, which is drier, you would have oaks and maybe hickories. And there was a study done in New Jersey in which the student actually was able to document very specific changes in the vegetation on north slopes and south slopes. So these are some of the interacting factors that ecologists play with as they look at vegetation.